Hello everyone, this is Scarzig and welcome back to another Runeterra tutorial. Thank you so much for the overwhelming positive response to my first video going over the basics of how the game typically plays out, and I did get asked to cover a little bit more in depth about reaction windows, right? When you are able to play your spells in response to your opponent and vice versa. A lot of games can be decided by you holding a card because you think you're going to have a chance to play it, but then that window never presents itself for some reason, and then vice versa, where you think that your opponent might not be able to play a card in response to what you're doing, but then somehow they are able to when you're not expecting it. So hopefully by clarifying these issues a little bit, we'll be able to get those wins. So let's jump right in. Okay, everyone, thank you for joining me. Let's jump in and see if we can clarify some of the times when you should be able to be reacting to what your opponent is doing and when your opponent will be able to play things in response to what you're doing. We'll call these reaction windows. I have a nice blank field set up here so that we can get some visual examples while I'm talking. So the first thing I quickly wanted to explain is when you have a spell or an ability from one of your units, a skill, waiting to resolve, you know that little circular symbol shows up here on the center of the board. This is called the stack, and all of those effects that are waiting to resolve resolve from the leftmost to the rightmost, right? So the last thing that is put on the stack happens first, and then everything else happens in order. So just a quick note to open it up and so you have a better idea of some of the other things that we're talking about. At the beginning of a round, one of the players gets the attack token. The player that didn't get the attack token the last round, right? It'll switch sides. And then the player that receives that attack token gets to take the first action for the round. So here in our blank setup, this will be the start of a round, and we get to take the first action. So we have a bunch of different choices. We have a bunch of different choices that we can make regarding what action we would like to take. And the first one is, of course, to pass. You don't have to play a card if you do not want to, or if you are unable to. You simply hit this button to pass, and if both players pass in a row, then a new round begins. The next thing you can do is cast burst spells. Now, the interesting thing about burst spells is that they do not take up your action for the round. You can cast as many burst spells as you would like, as many as you are able to, but you still have to click this button once everything is done, all of your burst spells are done, before your opponent can then take an action. The burst spells don't go on the stack the way the other spells and abilities that we mentioned before normally would. And burst spells, as you know, are denoted by this symbol here on the spell, and it'll say burst right here. So these are just some examples of some burst spells that you might see. These abilities happen immediately, and then the card disappears. And again, you can do those as many of those as you'd like before the action goes to your opponent here outside of combat. The next thing, of course, is playing a unit, which is just going to take your action. Some common units, of course, you will see here. Cythria is just a generic 1-drop, and Iceveil Archer and Avarosan Marksman have on-play abilities. Now, you'll notice this little yellow symbol next to Avarosan Marksman's. That means that this skill will go on the stack to give your opponent a chance to react to it. Iceveil Archer does not have that yellow symbol. That means that this effect of frostbiting an enemy just immediately happens. It's sort of like a burst spell. Even though this effect will activate before your opponent has a chance to react to it, playing the Iceveil Archer is still your action for the turn. Avarosan Marksman, however, that 1 damage goes on the stack, and then your opponent has an opportunity to put other effects on the stack, other fast spells in response to it. And so that brings us to the other type of spell that's very similar to playing a unit, which would be slow spells, right? They are denoted by this purple symbol here, and they say slow on the spell. You play them, the effects go on the stack just like any other spell, and then your opponent can play fast or burst spells in response to them. So now finally we get to fast spells. As we've been talking a little bit about them, fast spells, of course, are denoted by this yellow symbol here. They say fast right on the spell. And these are going to be your primary ways of interacting with your opponent and having your effects happen in response to theirs. And you have to remember, once one fast spell goes on the stack, you have to assign everything, and then it gives your opponent a reaction window to respond. So just to get further into that example, you've seen this before. You play the Mystic Shot, it goes on the stack, you assign the target for the Mystic Shot, and then you click this button to lock it in, and that is your action. Assuming that this would be your first thing that you do in a round, regardless if your opponent puts something on the stack in reaction to the Mystic Shot, then even if you respond back to that, once this happens, once this is all resolved, the next action will still go over to your opponent. That's very important to note. So if you had maybe some burst spells or something that you wanted to do, it's best to take care of those first, right? To get those out of the way so that you're able to get those down before your opponent does anything. Regarding burst spells in this situation, let's say you play the Mystic Shot, and then you have a burst spell that you would also like to play. You can resolve the burst spell before you lock in the Mystic Shot target, and then the reaction window goes to your opponent, but you can't play those burst spells onto the stack anymore until your opponent takes an action in response to the Mystic Shot. So finally, to get this example out of the way, the next choice that you have for an action you could take would be to just initiate combat. If you have the attack token, then you can simply use your action to initiate combat. Now, because this is an action, like some of the other things that we've discussed here, regardless of what happens during combat, once everything is done, once that combat happens, then the next action goes to the defending player. So let's clear this out of the way, and we'll go into some combat examples, because I know this is where most of the confusion happens, where you thought you might be able to play a spell, or your opponent was able to play a spell when you didn't think they were able to. So let's go ahead and maybe get some of these cleared up. So for combat, let's say you have Cithria of Cloudfield, your opponent has Garen, and you've got the burst buff Elixir of Wrath in your hand, and you want to use it. So in order to start off combat, as you know, you drag Cithria of Cloudfield up here onto the battlefield, and then you hit attack, right? Assign attackers. You click that button, and then it goes over to the opponent. The action goes over to the opponent, and they can choose, right, whether or not they want to assign blockers or not. It's important to note that at this step, where the attacker is assigning the attackers, they can also put fast spells on the stack, right? And this is all grouped up into one action where you lock that all in. So if you had some fast spells that you wanted to set up here, guaranteed to take place during combat, then you have to do it here when you assign attackers, because if your opponent does not decide to block, if they do not block, and if they do not react, if they don't play anything in reaction to any fast spells you might have put on the stack, then you don't get to do anything else. They just click skip block, right? When the button turns green here, they click skip block, and then combat resolves, and then the first action goes to them. As a defending player, sometimes it is a good strategy to put a fast spell onto the stack, because this will resolve during combat, right? Your fast or maybe your burst spells or what have you. These will resolve during this combat that's been initiated. But then, after combat, you still get to take the first action. Regardless of what happens here, the defending player gets to take the first action post-combat. So, If your opponent does not assign any blockers, then you don't get a chance to play Elixir of Wrath. You can, however, play Elixir of Wrath on Sith-3 of Cloudfield, and then hit assign attackers, right? So now you've got a 5-2 in play, and then your opponent probably doesn't want to block with Garen, so you get 5 damage to the Nexus. So you could, again, just get 2 damage, or, you know, you cast this buff ahead of time to give your opponent the choice to sacrifice their Garen potentially, or take 5 damage to their Nexus. So it all depends on a lot of factors, right? Whether or not your opponent can react. One interesting thing, however, is let's say you have Sith-3 of Cloudfield assigned as an attacker, and you have no fast spells or anything like that on the stack. If your opponent, even if they don't block, but they still play a spell, then it still gives you a reaction window to then put more spells on the stack. Not to assign more attackers, but to put more spells on the stack. Even if they cast a burst spell, which is really important, you assign an attacker, and your opponent doesn't want to block, but then they play a burst spell, maybe something like Rummage, right, to draw cards, then you can play Elixir of Wrath. You get the reaction window after they play Rummage. They'll play it, and then they still have to click Skip Block to verify that they aren't assigning any blockers, but then you still get the reaction window to play Elixir of Wrath. So if your opponent thinks that you have buffs in their hand, then they might choose not to do anything to rob you of that reaction window of being able to cast that buff. And again, that's pretty much a lot of the contention here when it comes to, I think, combat scenarios in Legends of Runeterra. So again, your opponent assigns a defender, and then you would be able to do any other abilities that you would like. If you were to, you know, they assign the defender, and they click block to lock that in, then the reaction window goes back to you, and then you say, okay, do I want to play any other spells or anything like that? And so you go, okay, well, if I play a buff, then it gives my opponent a chance to maybe do a buff or something in response to it. So then you get the opportunity to rob your opponent of another reaction window. Once your opponent assigns the defenders, and it's passed back to you to say go and initiate combat, then combat will resolve. But if you put a fast spell on the stack, or you cast a burst spell, then the reaction window goes back to the opponent. So it's kind of like combat has its own set of mini steps, right? Again, to recap, the attacking player initiates combat, they assign their attackers, and play any fast spells that they would like, and then they click the button. The defender assigns any defending units that they would like, or responds, puts more fast spells on the stack, or casts burst spells, and then they click block or whatever. They also click the button to pass back to you, and then once everything in combat is the way you like it, or you've used all of your mana, played all of your cards, done everything you wanted to do for that combat, you click this button a final time, combat happens, all of these spells will resolve first that are on the stack, and then combat resolves left to right. The first units over here will attack each other first, and then so on and so on, all the way down the line. And then, as we mentioned before, regardless of how many actions happened during combat or which players took those actions, after combat is all said and done, the defending player gets to take the next action post-combat. And again, they could even choose to pass. And so if they pass post-combat, you can then also do actions post-combat and vice versa. So hopefully that clarifies some of the situations where you will be able to maybe sneak in an extra buff here and there, or maybe when it's better not to react to your opponent's attack or to some of their spells. And when effects and things are resolving the way that you anticipate them, then you're much better able to outplay your opponent and get those wins. So thank you for joining me. All right, everyone, thank you so much for joining me again. And this is a very nuanced topic. I hope that I explained it well enough for all of you to understand, but if you have any further questions, please let me know in the comments down below, and I would be more than happy to answer those. And as you play and get more familiar with Runeterra, some of the examples that we went over today hopefully will make a little bit more sense with that real life context that you'll be able to provide. So thank you once again for all of your support. Don't forget to like and subscribe. If you have any friends that are getting into the game, or you see any new players asking about where they can learn, please show them this video. I think it'll be a really big help for them as well. So once again, thank you. Have a good one, and I will see you next time.